The apostles, also referred to as the 12, were the closest followers of Jesus. Each apostle, a leader in the early church, played a crucial part in the efforts to establish the church throughout the ancient world. Many of them perished as a direct result of their work in the ministry, frequently at the hands of the people they had been sent to convert. In the Bible, only 2 of their deaths are mentioned. There are numerous accounts of where and how the other apostles died, and most of what we know about their deaths comes from early Christian writers and church tradition. In today's video, we'll briefly examine the lives of the 12 apostles and how they died. Simon Peter. One of the most well-known followers of Jesus Christ and a key figure in the early Christian church was Simon, also known as Peter. Even according to Catholic tradition, he was the first pope. In addition, Jesus gave him the keys of the kingdom of heaven, which explains why he is frequently pictured at the heavenly gates in popular art and culture. He presided over the apostles after Jesus' death and was the first to work a miracle following Pentecost. Although some scholars dispute this, the 2 letters of Peter in the Bible are said to have been written by him. St. Peter is the traditional first pope of the Roman Catholic Church and is the patron saint of numerous organizations, businesses, and causes. He is revered as the patron saint of Rome, popes, and numerous places that bear his name, including St. Pierre and St. Petersburg. He is the patron saint of locksmiths because he holds the keys to heaven. He is also the patron saint of fishermen, shipbuilders, and net makers because he was once a fisherman. Furthermore, he is the patron saint of cobblers and people with foot issues, perhaps because he is said to have walked on water with Jesus. It shouldn't be shocking that he experienced a fate akin to Jesus. The way that Peter was crucified was peculiar. His cross was hung upside down. Church tradition holds that Peter was assassinated by Emperor Nero in 64 AD, following the Great Fire of Rome, which he famously blamed on Christians. Acts of Peter, a 2nd century apocryphal text, was the first to claim Peter was crucified upside down, allegedly because he did not consider himself worthy of dying the same death as Jesus. At the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus predicts Peter's death when he tells him, "When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." John remarks, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. The early church father Clement of Rome, who knew the apostles personally, said in his well-known letter 1 Clement, "Let us take the noble examples of our own generation. Through jealous and envy, the greatest and most just pillars of the church were persecuted and came even unto death. Peter, through unjust envy, endured not 1 or 2, but many labors, and at last, having delivered his testimony, departed unto the place of glory due to him." Eusebius, the father of church history, quotes a 2nd century scholar, Origen, as saying, "Peter was crucified at Rome with his head downwards, as he himself had desired to suffer." Roman soldiers were notorious for experimenting with different crucifixion techniques. Josephus, a Jewish Roman historian who lived in the 1st century, claimed that Roman soldiers didn't always crucify victims right side up, but experimented with various positions for their amusement. Andrew. Although the tradition's source isn't as reliable, it is told that Peter's brother Andrew died similarly. As per the tradition, around 60 AD, Andrew was martyred by crucifixion in the Greek city of Patras. Andrew was bound, not nailed, to a cross hung in an X shape rather than a T, because like his brother Peter, he didn't think he was worthy of dying in the same way as Jesus. Due to this, an X-shaped cross is occasionally called the St. Andrew's Cross. Unfortunately, this story's source isn't entirely trustworthy. It was discovered decades, perhaps even centuries after Andrew's death, and is taken from an apocryphal book called Acts of Andrew, which also contains numerous supernatural accounts of Andrew's miracles, including the assertion that he preached non-stop for 3 days while he was crucified. According to Acts of Andrew, the 3-day sermon Andrew delivered while he was near death included praise for the cross as a representation of Christ's lovely atonement. "Hail, O cross, inaugurated by the body of Christ and adorned with his limbs as though they were precious pearls. Before the Lord mounted you, you inspired an earthly fear. Now instead, endowed with heavenly love, you are accepted as a gift." The early church rightly regarded the book Acts of Andrew with suspicion, but church tradition apparently supported a similar account of his demise. According to Andrew's entry in Fox's Book of Martyrs, He preached the gospel to many Asiatic nations, but on his arrival at Edessa, he was taken and crucified on a cross, the two ends of which were fixed transversely in the ground, hence the derivation of the term St. Andrew's Cross. James the Great. Because of their fiery zeal, James and his younger brother St. John are known as the Boanerges, or Sons of Thunder. The first four disciples that Jesus called were St. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. When they asked Jesus about the temple's destruction, it sparked a discussion about the end of the world, which is mentioned in Mark. James was a part of the inner circle and saw the transfiguration, the raising of Jairus' daughter from the dead, and Jesus' suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane. James and John pleaded with Jesus to allow them to sit at his right and left sides in his future glory, but Jesus refused, saying it was not within his power. According to Spanish tradition, King Herod Agrippa I of Judea ordered James to be executed. His corpse was transported to Santiago de Compostela, where his shrine draws devoted Christians from all over the world. One of only two apostles whose demise is mentioned in the Bible is St. James, the first of Jesus' apostles to perish for following his faith. He was slashed to death with a sword. Acts 12 tells us about his death. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. King Herod was keen on gaining the Jews' favor. He thought that persecuting Christians would please his Jewish subjects, and it did, as the Jews wanted to stop Christianity from spreading. According to scholars, James was reportedly killed in Jerusalem in 44 AD. Eusebius of Caesarea cited Clement of Alexandria in the 4th century regarding James's death. He said that it appears that the guard who brought him into court was so moved when he saw him testify that he confessed that he too was a Christian, so they were both taken away together, and on the way he asked James to forgive him. James thought for a moment, then said, "I wish you peace," and kissed him, so both were beheaded at the same time. The first apostle to drink the cup Jesus drank was James. Although Clement of Alexandria was born a little more than a century after James passed away, he likely had access to documents and accounts that failed to survive. Even though there are many urban legends about well-known Christians, it's not difficult to envision this one being the case. John. John had a powerful position in the early church, as evidenced by his trip to Samaria with St. Peter to baptize new believers. He played a crucial role in St. Paul's conversion. Although the evidence is unclear, John was rumored to have opposed admitting Gentiles to the church. 3 letters, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, are credited to John in the Christian tradition. He's also attributed with authoring the Revelation to John and the 4th biblical narrative of the Gospel, though there has been much debate over who actually wrote these works. As per tradition, John is the only apostle to have passed away from old age. According to some other accounts, a few others passed away naturally, but John's tradition is the most well-established. Before he died, Jesus entrusted his mother Mary to the care of his most beloved disciple, who is often identified as John. John allegedly traveled to Ephesus after Mary passed away, where he wrote his 3 epistles. Then, as punishment for his gospel preaching, he was banished to the island of Patmos, where he received the revelation from Christ and composed the book of Revelation. He eventually returned to Ephesus, where he passed away peacefully sometime after 98 AD. This tradition considers that John the Apostle and John of Patmos are the same, and scholars aren't sure whether it's true or not. An early 3rd century Christian author named Tertullian claimed that before the Romans exiled John, they brought him into a Colosseum and submerged him in a vat of boiling oil. The entire arena converted to Christianity after he emerged unharmed. Because of this, some iconography depicts John in a pot of simmering oil. In the original apocryphal Acts of John, the Apostle died. However, later traditions assume that he was elevated to heaven. Officially, the Apostle's burial is at Ephesus. Philip. In the Synoptic Gospels lists of the Apostle, St. Philip the Apostle is only mentioned by name. He frequently appears in the Gospel. John claims that he came from Bethsaida, responded to Jesus' call, and played a key role in bringing St. Nathanael to Jesus. Christians initially confused Philip the Evangelist from the book of Acts with Philip the Apostle. Therefore, we are unable to identify which accounts specifically refer to Philip. Conflicting accounts have made this situation worse. Philip appeared to have been a member of a group influenced by St. John the Baptist at the time of his call. He participated in the miracle of the loaves and fishes, which is why he is represented by loaves in medieval art. He informed Jesus that some Greeks had requested to see him, bringing the news along with St. Andrew the Apostle. Philip asked Jesus in John 14:8-9 to reveal the Father, to which he replied, "Have I been with you so long, and yet you do not know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father." In essence, we don't know how Philip passed away. However, there are many options. According to one document, he passed away naturally. Some traditions claim he was beheaded, while others say he was stoned to death. As per another account, he was beheaded. A few also claim that he was crucified upside down like Peter and Andrew. Nevertheless, we definitely know that he passed away in the 1st century, possibly in or around the year 80 AD. Most of the earliest traditions point to him being martyred in the ancient Greek city of Hierapolis. In a letter addressed to Pope Victor, Polycrates of Ephesus wrote, "I speak of Philip, one of the 12 apostles, who is laid to rest at Hierapolis." A Christian writer in the 3rd century, Caius the Presbyter, wrote, "And after this there were 4 prophetesses, daughters of Philip, at Hierapolis in Asia. Their tomb is there, and that too of their father." This appears to be about Philip the evangelist, with 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. It's improbable that both Philips had 4 prophesying daughters. The earliest, most thorough account of his martyrdom is found in the Acts of Philip, though it's debatable to what extent we can trust it. The proconsul purportedly ordered Philip and Bartholomew to be crucified upside down after learning that Philip had allegedly converted the proconsul's wife. Philip preached to the people around while still hanging there, inspiring the crowd to free him. He instructed them to release Bartholomew, but not to kill him. Bartholomew. Nothing is known about Bartholomew from the New Testament aside from his mentions in 4 apostle lists. He might have gone by a different name because Bartholomew is a family name that means son of Tolmai or Talmai. In his ecclesiastical history, the 4th century bishop Eusebius of Caesarea writes that when the 2nd century teacher Saint Pantaenus of Alexandria visited India, he discovered a Hebrew copy of the Gospel according to Matthew that Bartholomew had left behind. Bartholomew was traditionally a missionary to Ethiopia, Mesopotamia, Lycaonia, modern Turkey, Parthia, modern Iran, and Armenia. According to legend, the apostle was beheaded and flayed to death at the order of the Armenian king Astyages. It is said that his remains were transported to Rome's Church of St. Bartholomew in the Tiber. Like many of the apostles, Bartholomew was likely martyred. However, this could have occurred in a few different scenarios. He was flayed and then beheaded, which is why the most prevalent depictions of him in art either feature him holding or donning his skin or link him to flaying knives. According to Fox's Book of Martyrs, he was at length cruelly beaten and then crucified by the impatient idolaters. The Golden Legend narrates several accounts. There be diverse opinions of the manner of his passion, for the blessed Dorotheus saith that he was crucified, and saith also, Bartholomew preached to men of India, and delivered to them the gospel after Matthew in their proper tongue. He died in Olban, a city of Great Armenia, crucified the head downward. It further says, Saint Theodorus saith that he was flayed, and it is read in many books that he was beheaded only, and this contrariety may be assailed in this manner, that some say that he was crucified and was taken down ere he died, and for to have greater torment he was flayed and at last beheaded. According to another tradition, he was beaten to unconsciousness and drowned in the sea. Whatever way Bartholomew passed away, it was probably quite horrifying. All of the traditions link Bartholomew's death to his ministry, even though they may not all agree on the specifics of how he passed away. If only they could all agree on the location of that. Thomas. Apostle Thomas is also known as the Doubting Thomas. In the Gospel of John, Thomas famously doubted Jesus' resurrection, telling the other disciples, Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Then Jesus showed up and offered to allow him to do just that. Upon seeing Jesus in the flesh with his own eyes and possibly touching the wounds, Thomas asserted, My Lord and my God. One of the most influential and prophetic statements about faith in all of Scripture was then delivered by Jesus in response. Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Thomas's brief period of doubt earned him the moniker Doubting Thomas, which later came to refer to anyone who requires evidence before believing something. Thomas set the stage for evidence-based faith and the Protestant doctrine of sola fide, or faith alone, by being cautious in his acceptance of the resurrection. Thomas, who lived more than 2,000 years ago, serves as a cautionary tale for modern Christians who have believed despite not having seen. The tradition surrounding the Apostle Thomas' death is pretty straightforward. According to the Acts of Thomas, Thomas was speared to death in Mylapore, India. According to Syrian Christian tradition, Thomas was killed with a spear on July 3, 72 AD in Mylapore. An early entry in the ecclesiastical calendar reads, 3rd of July, St. Thomas, who was pierced with a lance in India. There is no other tradition about his death. Matthew. When Jesus summoned Matthew into his presence, he was sitting by the customs house in Capernaum, which is today's Almagor, Israel, on the Sea of Galilee. If the identification of Matthew with Levi is accurate, Matthew would appear to be Levi's Christian name. Levi worked as a tax collector for Galilee's tetrarch Herod Antipas. The Pharisees' scribes criticized Jesus for eating with tax collectors and sinners because Levi's profession was one that was associated with suspicion and contempt everywhere. In response, Jesus said, "I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." The New Testament provides scant and ambiguous information about Matthew, aside from including him in the list of apostles, typically next to St. Thomas. Various conflicting accounts exist regarding Matthew's demise. Heraclian, one of the earliest commentators on the New Testament, is cited by Clement of Alexandria as stating that Matthew passed away naturally. But neither will this utterance be found to be spoken universally, for all the saved have confessed with the confession made by the voice and departed, of whom are Matthew, Philip, Thomas, Levi, and many others. However, even though earlier accounts are frequently thought to be more trustworthy because they were written closer to the time the events actually occurred, Heraclian's version is no longer widely accepted by academics. Although there is disagreement over the details of Matthew's execution, all other early accounts agree that he was martyred. The early church fathers said he was either beheaded, burned, stoned, or stabbed. In John Fox's famous Book of Martyrs, which was one of the most popular traditions known in the 16th century, the entry for Matthew states, "The scene of his labors was Parthia and Ethiopia, in which latter country he suffered martyrdom, being slain with a halberd in the city of Nadaba, AD 60. James, the son of Alphaeus. Whether or not you believe James, son of Alphaeus, is the same person as James the Just, the brother of Jesus, determines how he died. One of the most obscure apostles, James, son of Alphaeus, is only mentioned twice in the Bible, but James the Just was a significant figure in the early church. Church tradition asserts that they are the same James, but contemporary scholars contest this. According to tradition, James the Just was stoned to death after being beaten with a fuller's club and pushed from the temple's pinnacle where he was preaching. James, son of Alphaeus, is frequently portrayed in art holding a fuller's club, which reflects the church's belief that he was the same James as the Just. However, the tradition that claims James, son of Alphaeus, preached in Egypt believes he was crucified in the city of Ostrakine. The 2nd and 3rd century theologian Hippolytus is said to have recorded James's passing in on the 12 apostles of Christ, and James the son of Alphaeus, when preaching in Jerusalem, was stoned to death by the Jews and was buried there beside the temple. James, Jesus' brother, is said to have died in the same fashion, but scholars have little reason to believe on the 12 apostles of Christ. The text wasn't found until the 19th century, and the majority of scholars think it's pseudepigrapha writing that makes false claims about who wrote it. Jude. St. Jude is also called Judas, Thaddeus, or Lebbeus. The canonical letter of Jude, which forbids the licentious and blasphemous heretics, is attributed to him as its purported author. In the latter half of the 18th century, devotion to him as the patron saint of hopeless causes spread to France and Germany. In order to avoid confusion with the betrayer of Jesus, Judas Iscariot, St. Jude is described in John 14:22 as Judas but not Iscariot. In fact, it is likely that the tradition of calling him Jude rather than the scriptural Judas began to prevent such misunderstandings. Jude is thought to have died a martyr's death in Syria while on a missionary journey with Simon the Zealot. Because this tradition is based on an account from the dubious and legendary-filled book Acts of Simon and Jude, it is unclear how trustworthy it is. The Golden Legend claims that Simon and Jude give the order for demons to emerge from idols and destroy their own images. Then Jude and Simon are killed by religious leaders. And when the bishops saw this, they ran upon the apostles and hewed them to death anon. And that same hour, which was right fair weather, came so great thunder and lightning that the temple was smitten in three, and the two enchanters were turned into coals by the stroke of thunder. And the king bears the bodies of the apostles into his city, and did do make a church of marvelous greatness in the honor of them. Jude is often illustrated in art holding an axe to represent this tradition. Simon the Zealot. He is referred to as the Cananean or Cananios in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, which is frequently misunderstood to mean from Cana or from a Canaan. Luke refers to him as the Zealot in both Acts and his Gospel, and Cananios is the Greek transliteration of the Aramaic word Gan-Aniah. It is unclear if he belonged to the Jewish nationalist party known as the Zealots before the year 70 AD. It appears that the titles were an effort to set him apart from the apostle Saint Simon Peter. He is not mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. He is said to have preached the gospel in Egypt before joining the apostle Saint Judas in Persia. The earliest records of Simon the Zealot's death didn't appear until centuries after his passing, despite the fact that there are many accounts of his death. Like many of the apostles, it can be challenging to determine which tradition, if any, can be relied upon. Simon the Zealot was executed in the kingdom of Iberia according to Moses of Corine's account from the 5th century. According to the Golden Legend, he was crucified in Persia in 65 AD. Ethiopian Christians think Samaria is where he was crucified. According to a different account, he was crucified in Britain in 61 AD. Justus Lipsius in the 16th century claimed he was sawed in half, which is often symbolized in art. According to Eastern legend, he passed away in Edessa from old age. Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot is the only apostle whose demise is mentioned in the Bible aside from James. Judas, however, wasn't a martyr like James. He betrayed Jesus and then killed himself. It's interesting to note that the Bible provides two different accounts of Judas's demise. The Gospel of Matthew and the Book of Acts contain accounts of Judas's death. According to Matthew, Judas hanged himself immediately after the chief priests refused to take their money back, so Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. After that, the chief priests spent the cash on a field, which Matthew relates to Zechariah and Jeremiah's prophecies. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. Whereas Acts, traditionally attributed to St. Luke, gives a different account. With the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong, his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, so they called that field in their language Ekodama, that is, field of blood. Luke's accounts of Judas's death doesn't necessarily counter Matthew's. He might simply be referring to what transpired after Judas hanged himself. However, the question remains of who purchased the field, Judas or the chief priests. Additionally, they seem to disagree about why the field was given the title Field of Blood. Only Matthew's account mentions Judas feeling regret, and he makes a direct link between that remorse and Judas's suicide. Luke's account almost gives the impression that Judas was doomed to destruction, as if a violent death was just his punishment for betraying Jesus. Nevertheless, it seems that Judas passed away around the same time as Jesus, according to both accounts, and it most certainly wasn't from getting old.